unicycle, bicycle, tricycle, the cycle, home run, single, double, triple. Hey everyone, this is Will O'Toole. Thanking you for joining us for another edition of Park Ridge Sports History as I just kind of move in my seat here a little bit. This week, as the cartoon illustrates, I want to talk about baseball's most exciting moments, and that is when a player hits for a cycle. That means that in an individual game, he gets a base hit, a double, a triple, and a home run for a total of 4, 5, 7, 10 total bases. And usually, I can't always guarantee it because I haven't really done all the research, but generally the team goes on to have a big night offensively and probably win the game. But I want to go over a little bit of the history of the cycle and go over and even report on some of the firsts in each franchise and some of the little tidbits that go on with it. First of all, the very first one was done by George Hall way back in 1876 with the old Philadelphia A's. And of course, now they are the Oakland A's, soon to be either Las Vegas, San Jose, Sacramento, or maybe just defunct. We should just call them defunct A's, although they had a little bit of a winning streak this past week against the Yankees and a little bit against the Orioles. But that franchise, which had glory days in the 70s and the 80s while they were out in Oakland, hit the pits and the cellars when they were in Kansas City, and that all occurred when Connie Mack never decided to spend any money on the players, and they went from a pennant contender every year with the Jimmy Foxes and the Lefty Groves to basement dwellers for a good part, I would say at least 40 years in Major League. I mean, it was just unbelievable. Finally, I know that, well, Mack had sold the ball club when the A's moved to Kansas City and all the rest of it, but they were just a dead franchise for many years. But they do hold the distinction of having the very first player hit what was the recorded cycle way back in 1876. Now, the first guy to do it, and I'm wearing a shirt over one of my hoodies, is the Cincinnati Reds and John Riley way back when. And he did it also at the turn of the century. And these are players maybe the real Sabre guys are familiar with. I'm not going to devote too much time to them. I'd rather focus mine on the eras I grew up in or the eras I've read about, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. But there has been some unique things with the cycle. There was probably the cycle probably had its greatest run, ready for this, from 1970 to 2021, based on my little quick statistics, that every year baseball had some player who hit for the cycle. So you're talking about 52 years, consecutive years of a player hitting for the cycle. And in 1970, probably the real year I really followed baseball, they actually had 5, and I think that is the record. You had Wes Parker, a pretty good defensive first baseman who made the All-Star team that year with he didn't make the All-Star team in Cincinnati, but he did drive in 110 runs. Rod Carew, who would move the first base, he did it in his 4th season in the American League. Tommy Agee did it for the Mets. And I'm going to go back there because Tommy Agee was not the first Met to do it. Actually, that occurred, and I know my brother probably knows this one. It was Jim Hickman, who, ironically, would be the guy who drove in the game-winning RBI in the 70 All-Star game that season when he scored Pete Rose from second base. And, of course, they had Rose had the big collision, head-on collision with Ray Fosse at the plate. Tony Horton, who hit 23 home runs in 1970, and had a mercurial career. He seemed to be a promising star and then had some off-the-field problems, and he never really developed into the player that Cleveland was hoping he would be. And then another guy who I love, good player, probably symbolized the early 60s Giants. And that was a guy by the name of Jim Ray Hart. And why I say he kind of symbolized the Giants then, I'm going to give you his stats. He was a Yankee, good player. He was on the early 60s teams with the Giants, and then bounced around from the Giants to the Yankees in the 73 season. But Jim Ray Hart, from 1964 to 1967, hit over 20 home runs and averaged over 80 RBIs for the Giants. Now, the problem was this. He was a third baseman outfielder. They had McCovey on those 63, 64 teams, and they had Orlando Cepeda. They did have Willie Mays manning center field, but you can see where I'm going with this. They had a lot of firepower in those three players, but really nothing suitable for all three to play. And eventually what happens is they settle for Hart at third base. Okay, he's no Brooks, but then again, nobody is a Brooks Robinson. But he isn't even maybe like an Ed Charles. He kind of was clunky over at third base, and he does go back and forth between the outfield and third base. And then you had, of course, Orlando Cepeda, who, like McCovey, did play the outfield a bit, but he was more suited for first base. So the Giants in those early 60s teams were kind of weighted down with these, what Bill James, well, anybody would call, but he kind of broke it down, corner players who couldn't play the interior. And when you have too many of the corner players, yes, it's going to be a burden, not so much offensively. It's going to be a huge burden on your defense, obviously. So the Giants had to do something. They do unload, I shouldn't say that. They do trade Orlando Cepeda, who goes to the Cardinals and promptly wins an MVP and leads the Cardinals to the 67 World Series. Jim Ray Hart mans third base. Willie McCovey goes over to first. And then, fortunately, in the later 60s, they do get Bobby Bonds to man right field with Willie, the aging Mays, in center. But why I say Jim Ray Hart was kind of symbolized those Giants teams, like I said, good hitter, had some home run power, obviously ready for this. From 1964 to 1968, he hit 31, 23, 33, 29, and 23 home runs, and never drove in 100, but got close three times, 96, 93, and 99 RBI, and then hit in the 280 range. He was a good, solid player, and probably today would be an unbelievable DH for some team. And like I said, those Giants could never kind of get over that, find the right combination of players. Yeah, I know, they do win the 62 pennant, but they always came up short against the Dodgers in 65, in 66, in 63, and it was really a case of just being overloaded with the same type of player, if you know what I mean. And but Jim Ray Hart hits for the cycle in 1970. Tommy Agee, of course, you could actually make an argument that maybe Agee might have been the MVP of the 1969 World Series. I have always felt it should have been Jerry Koosman with the 2 wins. They did give it to Don Clendenon because he did hammer 3 home runs. And, of course, usually the MVP goes to an offensive player over a defensive player. But I'm telling you right now, if Koosman doesn't win that second game in Baltimore, the Mets may have gotten swept. He kind of settles the Mets down, throws a gem of a game, and then wins Game 5 at home. Still with pressure because they had to win that, because you're saying, okay, if the Orioles can get back in this, get it to 3-2 and go back to Baltimore, they may win this thing with, obviously 3 straight wins. It wasn't out of the realm. So that was a huge game that Koosman pitched, Game 2 and, of course, Game 5. So I've always made the argument he should have been the MVP. Nonetheless, 1970 was, wow, just a ton of players who hit for the cycle. And like I said, 1970 to 2021, 52 years of players who hit for the cycle, at least one a year. And the only other year the only other time period I saw was between 1920 and 1941, when you had 22 years of players hitting for the cycle. Ready for this? Obviously, I told you who was the first guy for the Mets. That was Jim Hickman in 1963. He did it for those crummy Met teams of the 60s, but he does have a monster year for the 70 Cubs. He hit 42 home runs, and that's why he was named to the All-Star game. Although, still to this day, I'm convinced that Billy Williams probably should have made that team. He basically had the same, if not better, stats for that 1970. Even at the All-Star break, his stats really matched Jim Hickman's. But sometimes Leo DeRocher was an assistant on that coaching staff of Gil Hodges. So maybe he said, hey, you know what? Billy has made it a couple of times. Let's get it to somebody new. Could have gone into the decisions. George Sisler was the very first St. Louis Brown, and a fellow by the name of Burt Daniels, playing for the New York Highlanders, which of course becomes the New York Yankees. He was the first one to hit for the cycle for the New York franchise. Interesting enough. I think the more fun ones are this. Jim King was the first one to hit for the cycle for the new Washington Senators. And Rod Carew, of course, in 1970 would be the first Minnesota Twin to hit for the cycle. Here's a wild one. 1971. And I always knew him as, with his nickname, Little, as in Little Freddie Patek. He was about 5'4". They always put him on the baseball card. But Freddie Patek was a little, really little, even by baseball standards, but he was a very tough, hard-nosed shortstop for both the Pirates and then later on with the Kansas City Royals. In fact, he would be the Royal shortstop in those great 1976, 1977, and 1978 playoffs against the New York Yankees. Good player, solid. Not a Hall of Fame, but he does have the record of being the first KC Royal player to hit for the cycle. Here's one that I was amazed at. Cesar Cedeno hit for 2 cycles while a member of the Astros. He's actually the first Astro to hit for the cycle. Now, why I say that is that Cedeno, of course, had unbelievable talent. I'm going to just run him up here. You know, it's so funny, and this is the beauty of this. I was just with my brothers the other day. We were at a repast for a funeral, and we were talking baseball. We were talking sports, and along with my brother-in-law. Make a long story short, or even longer, we're talking, and then the conversations just go off on tangents. And I was telling my brother, I said, this is how I kind of want this show, because this is what actually happens. You're sitting down talking sports, and one thing leads to another, which leads to another, and pretty soon what the conversation, which had begun as basketball with the NBA and the Lakers, turned into, all right, who would you pick before Nolan Ryan to be your pitcher in a Game 7 scenario World Series? And of course, actually, I would say unanimously, all of us selected Bob Gibson. And we did have other selections. We did have other choices, Jim Palmer. And they had to be, let's say, contemporaries of Nolan Ryan. And of course, when you say contemporaries of Nolan Ryan, you're talking about 26 years of baseball. So he could theoretically go all the way back to Don Drysdale. He might have been up there for the last year of Sandy Koufax. But when I posed this question to my brothers and brother-in-law, it was more like, all right, I'm talking about contemporaries, but really the meat of his career. And it wasn't a knock against Nolan Ryan. It's just really a sense of great pitcher, taking nothing away from him. But he would not be my first selection to take the mound. Mine has always been Bob Gibson, and I am a lover of Tom Seaver. You have to love Steve Carlton, and these were all contemporaries of Nolan Ryan. You might even take Mickey Lolich, who was really a good pitcher. Okay, and then we kind of narrowed it even more. We got it down to potentially Hall of Famers, and because I had mentioned I would probably take Andy Pettitte, but of course he's not in the Hall of Fame. And I even said Roger Clemens, or my brother-in-law said Roger Clemens. And my brother, who's a Red Sox fan, said no, he wouldn't take Roger Clemens. He would take Louis Tiante. So then we didn't want too many choices. We wanted to kind of narrow it to Hall of Famers, because this is what you do when you're sitting around talking sports. You just kind of change the rules in the conversation. And so we all kind of came to the choice that it would be Bob Gibson. My big problem with Bob Gibson has always been, I feel like he should have won 300 games. And I'm so disappointed he only won 251. And everybody poo-poos that I'm disappointed. But really, he was just an unbelievable pitcher in my mind. You have that 67 and 68 seasons that he put together for the Cardinals. He was a monster in the World Series. Of course, his Game 7 effort in 1964 against the Yankees, winning that game on just pure grit, 7-5. I mean, this is what makes Bob Gibson Bob Gibson. And, there are other guys, like we said. But see where I'm going here? I went from the cycle to talking about great pitchers. But Cedeno was this player. I just want to give you what potentially he was. And I don't know why. He kind of fell off the landscape. I know he had a lot of injuries, but Cedeno, he had a 53 WAR. That I couldn't believe. He had some monster years playing in that dump. I mean, in the Astrodome. He led the league as a 20 and 21-year-old in doubles. He had 40 doubles and 39 doubles in 1971 and 72. In 1970, he came up for 90 games, and in those 90 games, 7 homers, 42 RBIs, and a .310 batting average. So you knew that this guy had some unbelievable talent. Just to give you probably his best season, he finished 6th, but I don't think that is his best season. In 1972, he had 39 doubles to lead the league, 8 triples, 22 home runs, 82 ribbies, and 103 runs scored, and he hit .320. He finished 6th in the MVP voting that year. Personally, I think his 74 season and he's only 23 at the age of 74. Had 26, 102, 269, 64 walks. I know his batting average was a little down, scored 95 runs, but drove in a ton of runs for the 74 team. And then what happened, and to a certain extent, yes, it wasn't really Cedeno as much as the Astro organization. In 75, they finished in last place. The team needs to be transitioned. They do have Cedeno. They do have a couple of good pitchers, but they needed to rearm themselves. Put it this way, that 75 Astro team, just to give you an idea, had Bob Watson, had Cesar Cedeno, had a guy by the name of Jose Cruz, who would be an Astro legend, good player, solid player. They had Cliff Johnson, who hit 20 home runs in 122 games. And, of course, you Yankee fans will remember him because he had some big, big moments for the Yankees when he came over as a DH. He is a guy that would have been a perfect DH. Like Watson, he came up as a catcher, but they really weren't suited to be a catcher. But this guy, had you take it, for people who never saw the Astros play in the Astrodome, all I can say is it would be like walking in the Lincoln Tunnel. The echo in that place, number one. And it always sounded like the air conditioning was on full throttle. And the ball never seemed to be hit all that well. It was just a real travesty that the Astros played in that place for so many years. They even changed their name from the Colt 45s to the Astros just to put that the eighth wonder of the world. Believe me, it was not the eighth wonder of the world. Yes, it was probably the first. It was the first dome stadium, but even then they had problems with it, with the windows and the glare and all the rest of it. They go to AstroTurf. The AstroTurf was really hard. Ask the Houston Oilers about that when they played football. It was just an ugly, 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 did I say ugly ballpark? And the players, even the pitchers, they can say, well, the pitchers had an advantage down there, but I bet you if you actually asked the pitchers, they were happier pitching outside and in another venue. And of course, the hitters. One thing that proved this, how bad the Astrodome was for Astro hitters, is that back in the 80s when they were still playing there, the Astros apparently like 84, 85, and 86, they had a number of doubles hitters on their team. Not big home run hitters, just solid doubles hitters. And I think they had the highest slugging percentage of any team in the visitors' park. Put them in the Astrodome and it reduced them to, just mediocre numbers. Take them out where they were allowed with the wind and just a nice environment. Man, they could really hit the ball. And of course, in 1986, when they met the Mets, they took them, to the final game, losing that didn't take them to the final game, but lost to them in 6 games. For the Met fans, it was like the final game because rooting for the Mets then, you knew that if they had to face Mike Scott in Game 7, the Mets had no chance of winning. That's why that game is so remembered by Met fans and why it goes down as a classic. It went extra innings. I think it went 13 innings. Both teams went back and forth in the lead. Actually, the Astros had a 3-0 lead late in that game, and then the Mets rallied behind Dykstra and a number of the other players on that Met team. But that Astro team could hit. And, man, they thumped the ball everywhere else. Like, I think Chicago and Wrigley Field, they might have been their best they might have been their easiest victims for them to hit. But Cliff Johnson was on that team. And my whole point is this. They had some quality pitchers still. They had Larry Durker, a young, upcoming J.R. Richard. They had Ken Forsch. They had Joe Niekro. And Niekro would win a couple of times. I think he won 20 games. Dave Roberts had some good years. And Ken Forsch and his brother Bob Forsch. Ken Forsch was a solid pitcher, but they never did anything. He actually had a 114, 113 record. He won double digits 3, 4, 5, 6 times in his career with Houston and California. So he was solid. I'm not saying he's going to be the ace of your staff, but he was a solid player. But that Astro team didn't do much after that. They had a couple of good players, but they never really did any. I will tell you this, too. Roger Metzger was the shortstop on that team. I know that he had a lawnmower accident, and I think either did some damage to his fingers or even cut a couple of the digits off, and I don't think he was ever the same. Doug Rader was on the other side of 30. He was a solid third baseman, but they needed something else. And Cedeno and Watson weren't going to do it by themselves. Durker wasn't going to do it with those three. They needed other players. The Astros simply didn't go out and do anything. And as a result, here's what happened. That team finished 64-97. And basically, they clean house. But the guys who they clean house with are the victims are Cedeno, because he goes eventually off to the Reds. And even though and Bob Watson, of course, is shipped to the Red Sox, which wasn't a bad move for Bob Watson. I'll tell you that in a second. But Cedeno, he is on that 79 team, but by that time he's 28, only played 132 games, had only 7 homers, 23 RBIs. I know he got hurt, and maybe the Astrodome took something out of his legs and all the rest of it. And that's what I mean. Like his career, just look at the beginning of his career from age 20. He came up as a 19-year-old, and from age 20 to 24, he was a superstar. Could do all 5 things: hit for power, run, throw, and play defense. And many people called him, might have called him the Latin Willie Mays, as I recall. Anyway, he kind of got old fast. Bob Watson is the guy who I loved as a player. I do have a great picture of him, Howard. It's from 1970. He, like Cliff Johnson, came up as a catcher. He actually finished with a 28 WAR, 184 home runs, 295 batting average. Solid player from basically 1972 to 1979. He was double digits in home runs. All right, more of a line drive guy, but would guarantee you about 15, 16 home runs a year. He did have a high of 22 home runs, 110 RBIs in 1977. That was when he was 31. He's traded, and the Red Sox bring him in as a bat, DH. In 1979, he played 84 games for the Red Sox after being dealt by the Astros. He actually hit 13 homers, 53 RBIs, and hit .337 in part-time duty for the Red Sox. It's a shame that the Red Sox didn't make a deal for him in 78. It's a shame because he probably would have gotten him over the hump, especially maybe that playoff game against the Yankees. Instead, they do trade for him a year too late, and it's a little bit too little for them. But in 1979, he becomes the first player in Major League history to hit for the cycle in both leagues. So, yes, I like the fact that Watson had a little bit of history there. And, of course, he becomes a successful general manager for the New York Yankees. He's a class act. And you know what? You start to think between his role as a general manager and his playing days, you wonder if this guy and the fact now his WAR is too low, 28. So Daniel probably has a better chance at 53. But, he's one of those guys. And you know what? I guess I got to take it back because you know what? There are too many guys sometimes. You think about it, too many guys in the Hall of Fame. But as I always say this, I make this case. Okay, do you think Lou Brock belongs in the Hall of Fame? Yes. Well, he's a bad one. I'm thinking about guys who don't get in on the first ballot. But then the writers say, yeah, I think he's a Hall of Famer. Well, why don't you vote him in on the first ballot? Because we don't think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. And all the time I've heard this, and I'm wrong about Brock because I think he got in on the first ballot, and I do believe that. But there are other players, and of course I can't think of them right now. But whenever I hear that, I say, if you didn't vote for him now because you don't think he's a first-year Hall of Fame selection, things could happen. God forbid. He could die or things change. Maybe you lose your vote or surrender your vote as a Hall of Fame voter and someone else doesn't think of it or doesn't even remember him or doesn't think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. So that is, I think that is just inexcusable. That's not a good reason to not vote him in. Now, if you're saying this, like Lou Brock, everyone knows Lou Brock is a Hall of Fame. Great World Series, all the rest of it. Far superior to many of them that are in the Hall of Fame. But we also realize this, based on the body of work. Is Lou Brock a Hall of Famer? Yes. Is he on the same level as Willie Mays, Hank Aaron, Roberto Clemente? No. But baseball fans know that. Baseball fans know, and this goes out to the writers who vote, baseball fans know that there is levels of greatness even in the Hall of Fame. Yes, the guys at the top, the Ruths, the Berras, the Mazes, the Williams. Then there's that second tier, all right, players like Lou Brock, players like Bert Blyleven. I would probably maybe even put him a few steps lower, okay? We know that there are tiers of greatness, and we don't need to, let's say, be, I don't know, lectured to about greatness, about first ballot Hall of Fame and all the rest of it, okay? So there's my little opine for the day. Here's a great one I want you to remember. The first Seattle or ex-Seattle pilot and actually first Brewer to hit for the cycle was Mike Hegan. And of course, Hegan, it has kind of a major role in the book I Love, Ball 4, and I guess this is why I went crazy on this. Hegan was a pretty good player. Just a solid player. He was better off in the utility role that he performed for, let's say, the Oakland A's and the Milwaukee Brewers. I know he was a kind of a cog for the Seattle Pilots, does make the All-Star team, doesn't play because he got hurt. Don Mincher plays in his place, but even he didn't get, no, I think he went 0 for 1 in the game. I always get that confused. But nonetheless, Hegan was the first guy to hit for the cycle for the Brewers, 1976. The first guy in Colorado history was Dante Bichette. And the first guy for the Expos, this is going to rankle you, it's actually Tim Foley. I couldn't believe that. Tim Foley was the first Expo. Now, the reason I said it is because Foley, I think, hit like 5 home runs in his whole career. And here he is hitting a home run in a game where he hits for the cycle. There have been 344, the last one being Jose Altuve, who did it last August, so we're still waiting for the first one of the year. In 1977 was the year that the Seattle Mariners and the Toronto Blue Jays were birthed. And actually, the first Seattle Mariner was Jay Buhner. That was 1993. The first Blue Jay. First one was Kelly Gruber, 1989. Now, Gruber was a solid player. He had 3-4 good years, and then he fell off. But he was a solid player. But he is the first one for the Toronto Blue Jays to hit for the cycle. Now, that's a segue into this. But before I get to that, actually, the last guy in the 20th century to hit for the cycle was Chris Singleton for the White Sox in 1999. Now, I know I sound like I'm going off on tangents. I just kind of want to get this in. I'm just blurting out all these cycle stats and all the rest of it. Why I talk about Singleton, 1999? Because the first guy in the 21st century was a Chicago White Sox teammate, Jose Valentin. All right? And he does it for the White Sox in 2000. So the White Sox are the last team to have a guy hit for the cycle in the 20th century. They are the first franchise to have a guy hit for the cycle in the 21st century. Speaking of which, Luis Gonzalez, the first guy for Arizona, did it. And Trey Turner is the first Washington National. And you remember that the Nationals moved from Montreal in that whole thing. So Foley is the first one. And I think, no, I'm not even going to guess. I think the last guy to do it for the Expos was Vlad Guerrero, who did it for a Hall of Famer, did it September 14, 2003 for the Montreal Expos before they moved the franchise to Washington. And then, of course, Oddibe McDowell is the first guy. He's the first guy to do it for the Rangers, hit for the cycle. So kind of interesting as well. Now, why I bring up the Toronto Blue Jays? Because there have been only 2 father-son combinations to hit for the cycle. One of them is Gary and Darrell Ward. And I do have the stats on Gary and Darrell. Darrell Ward, to be honest with you, it's when my son was young and wasn't able to spend all my hours watching sports on TV. But he played from 1998 to 2008, retired age 33, played for Houston, LA, Pittsburgh, Washington, Atlanta, and Chicago. He hit for the cycle while with Houston. He had a couple solid years, and yet he has a negative 4.5 WAR for his career. Consider this. Played 119 games with the Astros in the year 2000. Had 20 homers, 47 RBIs, hit .258, drew only 15 walks. And, of course, we know that that's become a big deal. But he had 32 extra base hits out of 68 hits. Put it this way. He's not making Ted Williams roll over in his grave. But at the same time, I think any manager would be happy with a guy with some power, had some played the outfield, doesn't display too much speed, didn't steal any bases, but he does have some power, extra base potential, and with those 68 hits, he scored 36 runs and had 47 RBIs. So you're talking about a guy who produced 83 runs for you, in one way or the other. Comes back the next year and in 95 games was 9-39. Then comes back 2002, probably has, I would consider, his best overall year in his career. And of course, it's that magical number of age 27, for Bill James. And people, I'm alluding to baseball, his baseball books, and he loved to talk about and did the research. Seems like age 27 is when a player will have his best statistical year, probably because he's really matured, has the experience, the know-how, and he's just ready for the game. And age 27, 12 homers, 72 RBIs, scored 41 runs, hit a solid 276, and drew 33 walks, which would be the second high of his career. His dad, though, was a pretty good player. Gary Ward, all right, does finish with a 17 WAR. And again, we've talked about that. He had a pretty good year in 1982 when the Minnesota Twins finished in last place. But he's age 28. He was 28, 91, 289. Again, didn't draw too many walks, although it does increase over the next few years. With Minnesota, he makes the All-Star team in 1983. And, of course, with Minnesota, he does hit for the cycle. He has 19 homers, 88 RBIs, 278. And then probably his best season was with Minnesota, age 30, 1984. He goes 21, 79, drew 55 walks, hit 284, and had an on-base percentage of 343. Not bad. Solid player. Played 12 years. His son played 11. Bounced around Minnesota, New York, Yankees, Texas, of course, and finished up his career with Detroit. Had 130 lifetime home runs, and Baseball Reference gives him on a 162 game playing. He would be 1675, 276. Not bad numbers for maybe a third outfielder or your third best outfielder or your DH, okay? Then we have a guy by the name of Cavan Biggio and Craig Biggio, the Hall of Famer. Both those players, father, son. And, of course, Biggio came up today in one of my classes. I was talking about this great Seton Hall team that they had back in the 80s before. They had a kid who was the leading hitter in the country, Martise Robinson. I think he hit 486. And of the four guys on that team, John Valentin, Mo Vaughn, and Craig Biggio, I don't think he ever got or broke into the major leagues. I think he got as high as AAA. That team was potent, but they never made the College World Series. A little bit different now, or they started that super tournament, really like 64 teams, and then they winnow it to the 8 or 10 that go to Omaha. I think it's 8 that go to Omaha and play. The Rick Cerrone 75 or 74 Seton Hall team, they were the last to go to the World Series for the Pirates. A little bit different, but interestingly enough, Biggio and Cerrone, both catchers. Cerrone lasted a ton of years in Major League Baseball. He played 21 some odd years in the major leagues. Yeah, he didn't play 100 and some odd games every year, but he was a serviceable catcher, valuable backup, and people don't realize he finished 7th in the MVP vote in 1980 when he was acquired by the Yankees over the winter. So he had a solid year that year. Last thing. So those were the two guys that, or the two families, father, son, that led or had Triple Crown nights in Major League Baseball. And of course, my time is ending. And actually, I got to much of what I wanted to talk about. And maybe next week, I'll just add a couple of things that I missed here. But I thank you for joining us. Howard, as always, a shout out to you for the wonderful job you do of producing the show and adding some real color and the pictures and the music. Everyone, have a great week. See you next time on Park Ridge Sports History. This is Will O'Toole. Thanking you again. Bye now.